What's up, guys? Back with another video. This is Growth Starts Within, part 7. And I want to come talk to you guys about unconditional love. My biggest question would be, how can one love themselves or someone else unconditionally? And, I have to break that down to really help everybody understand what that looks like. For one, to properly grow in love, there are many considerations, but the most important thing to consider is where you are. Where do you stand with yourself? How do you feel about dating or even just relationships you keep in general? Maintaining unconditional love can be broken down in about 7 different statements or questions. So I'll start with, do you love yourself? And that's the first thing you have to know as you are going through life or dealing with people or, even maintaining a relationship is, do you love yourself? The most important question, because if you don't love yourself, then you got some work to do. And even if you do love yourself, you still have more work to do, because how do you love yourself? Are you loving yourself in proper ways? Are you loving yourself with passion? Are you loving yourself with, frustration for your mistakes? That's a very important question. And it breaks down into really analyzing your self-love. So that's first and foremost. Do you love yourself? And if you do, how good are you loving yourself? Or how much are you loving yourself? And then that's where you flow into the question of, have you forgiven others for the hurts they left? So, okay, you love yourself, but then you might hate the fact that people have done this to you, or have frustration towards some of the pain you have had to endure in life, or, even something in the sense of like childhood trauma. That kind of thing can really leave a person down for a long time. So, have you forgiven others for that hurt they left? And if not, then I want you to know that's showing up in the way you love yourself, because if you haven't forgiven them for the hurt they left, then you haven't forgiven yourself for allowing them to hurt you, and that becomes a bigger problem. It limits your ability to love passionately, or, in a more deeper sense, because you're still hurting. You haven't healed, and that's very important in the sense of growing and loving yourself unconditionally. So first is loving yourself, but second is forgiving yourself as well as forgiving others for the hurt they left. So then I go into the question of, have you forgiven yourself for the hurts? And if you haven't, it's really a process, but it can be very easy when you start doing the work, because forgiving yourself for the hurt is more like, accepting that you didn't know, accepting that, you didn't understand or didn't have the tools, or it's out of your control. That's a great way to forgive yourself for the hurt, because it's not your fault. Sometimes it's not your fault that they are struggling, that they're unforgiving or has done something unforgivable. That's not on you. And the more you put it on you, the more it weighs on your spirit. But really, just forgive yourself for not knowing, or not even being able to do nothing. It sounds crazy, but you got to forgive yourself for not being able to do nothing. That's not in your hands. Sometimes you got to leave it to God, and you can't be mad at yourself, because you have to leave it to God and allow Him to deal with them, versus you dealing with them. It'll work itself out, but you got to have that faith. So that flows me into the next question of, are you dating for love, or do you love to date? That's where it comes in with the relationships you're trying to maintain, or even the relationship you have. Are you dating, with purpose, or are you just dating people, And either one is okay, but these are reflective questions. These aren't questions to belittle you or make you think you are doing things wrong. It's for you to question what you're doing and start doing them right. If you aren't loving yourself completely, then love yourself better. And how do you do that? You start by forgiving yourself. You start by forgiving others. And then you flow into actually recognizing how you are dating, why you are dating. Are you dating to marry somebody? Are you dating to just, have a relationship? Are you just going out with people? You know, that's a that's how you start to analyze your dating patterns. And even just with the love, are you doing things out of love, for love, for somebody to love you better? Or are you doing things because you love them? These are questions you have to answer for yourself in your relationships, and in the relation, in the deeper relationships or more intimate relationships you carry with someone else. Without really understanding your purpose or goal, you fail yourself, and you can't allow others to, dictate how you feel, what you think. At the end of the day, I date to marry. I don't date people because I just want to take somebody out. I hate wasting my money. But I do date to marry. So when I am, going on dates with somebody and, showing up for somebody in that way, is because my goal is to get to know them on a deeper level. I want to know your fears. I want to know your struggles. You know, Even just in my personal relationships with my friends and families, I know their fears, their struggles. I talk to them about their problems, and we work things out, in the healthiest manner. And that's the same I do with my girlfriend. I want to know how you feeling and what's going on in your life so I can show up for you best. And it may take time because we all communicate and express things differently. But that's where it's important to build and maintain relationships in a positive manner, because you're able to recognize the patterns. You're able to see them in a different light, because you're not loving them or dating them just to have them. You're dating them to be there for them. You're loving them to show them something deeper and show them that it's someone there that cares. And that comes with a passionate purpose. So without that, you might just be, having sex with a bunch of shorties, or, kicking it with guys all the time. And that's cool. I'm not here to judge you. That's just me letting you know that without that purpose in dating, you'll mistakenly just do things. So we go from loving yourself, forgiving others, forgiving yourself, and then knowing what your dating patterns are and the reason you are dating. And after that, my next statement goes into the same thing. Are you dating to marry, or do you love to chase? Some people just love to chase. Love being an option, love being at the forefront of things and being the center of attention. And a lot of people take that into relationships, which is very, I won't even say just traumatic, but traumatized. It's daunting because it limits your growth in the relationship. You're really trying to be the center of attention when, like I wrote in my book, when you're dating someone, when you love someone, these actions aren't just subtle. You aren't loving someone for the moment. You become the center of their attention. So if my focus is you every single day, if my thought process relies on you every single day, then guess what? I need you to think of me in that same way, in that same depth, in that same capacity. And without it, now we are missing each other. Now, that don't mean you just gonna know what I need without me speaking on it, or you'll be able to show up without me working on it. But that's how people who love to chase move. They move in a way where it's my way or the highway. You gotta know me or you don't. And that's not fair to a real relationship. A relationship with passion to become marriage. That's not how you operate in those spaces. But a lot of people do. So that's where, all of this stems and goes back to unconditionally loving somebody, and also unconditionally loving yourself. When you love yourself to a certain degree, you wouldn't be doing these things and moving in these ways. It just wouldn't work like that. So that's where you have to learn what your patterns are and kind of change them in a way, because if you are trying to have a long-lasting love, get into a marriage and a deeper relationship, you have to have proper patterns. You have to be making proper decisions for that love. You have to recognize the mistakes. You got to be able to recognize that you love to chase, or you like being the center of attention. You know what I'm saying? You have to be able to see that you dating, for love. You dating for somebody to love you. You're not trying to really work on changing or growing or be a different person. And that's okay. Now, that's not me knocking you or telling you wrong for that. You have to be aware of that, though. And so many people are unaware of their habits and patterns that are damaging to relationships, that are really exploiting the pain and love, the pain inside you. And that's not what I want for anybody that I know, not even for myself. So then it comes into a question of, what does loving someone every day look like? It looks the same as it looks for yourself. How are you loving yourself every day? Are you, reading devotionals to learn about your patterns to break? Are you following a higher power? That don't mean you got a Bible thumper all the time, and that don't mean you got to, follow all the scriptures, but that also means you have to have someone, or something above you that you believe in, that's giving you peace, giving you love. And for me, that's God. Now, I would encourage you to find God, you know, because loving someone every day looks like, going to God for your struggles and your troubles, but also going within yourself to understand where you make mistakes at, the things you need to work on, the ways you aren't showing up properly. That comes into a question as well. You can't show up for somebody every day and you're not even showing up for you. You ain't at a peace in your mind. You don't have, a proper placement in your life for yourself, and you are wondering why someone else can't show up for you better. And that's the issue. You ain't doing what you need to for yourself. So that's a situation of showing up for you. For me, that's like reading my devotionals, reading my inspirational quotes, being on point. Without that, that's not, you know, that's not going to show up the best. Without me showing up better for myself, I'm not going to show up better for someone else. And that's why you love someone unconditionally, because I want to show up for someone in a way that they never forget. And I want to do that for everybody. So I love everybody that enters my life unconditionally. I want to show up for you in the best manner. Even if that's, a struggle at times or I make mistakes, I try to change anything that I fought on because I care. I care enough to show up for the people I love. And I just need them sometimes to address me in proper ways, show up for themselves better so they can show up for me better. And that's not asking for too much. That's not telling you wrong for who you are. In the end, love grows over time. And it starts with your being. And if you don't build it, you just will struggle. And I don't want that.